Hi everyone, this is Sarah, and today I want to talk about something I've been thinking about, which is how we label the conscious and unconscious, or sometimes some subconscious mind. And I'm coming to the conclusion that if we're thinking about it in terms of brain activity, then these labels are perhaps a little bit unhelpful. So let me give you a bit of background to what I'm thinking about. So let's look at the definition of unconscious. So unconscious talks about being not awake and not aware in the dictionary, and things happening without us realizing. And it also talks about a noun, something that is inaccessible to the unconscious mind, but which affects behavior and emotions. So what's interesting for me about this is the fact that unconscious, or even the word subconscious if you choose to use that, sort of represents something that is lesser than the conscious mind. And this for me is really unhelpful because the unconscious mind is constantly operating, and it is in constant activity, and it has a lot of different processes which are different to the conscious mind, or functions which are different to the conscious mind, and it is equally powerful. Now, let's look at the definition of the conscious mind. What's interesting about this for me is that the relationship to knowledge. So conscious is having knowledge of something, so knowing something. So it almost suggests that unconscious is not knowing something. However, there's a huge amount of knowledge stored in our unconscious mind. It's constantly acting like a database. It is constantly feeding back to the conscious mind, and the conscious mind is feeding into it. So I just want to talk about, or put this in context a little bit for me, especially from a mind work perspective, or the work that we do in emotional release or timeline therapy and NLP. So let me just frame what I'm talking about here. So really what we're talking about isn't so much consciousness. And consciousness is a huge subject that I'm not really going to address in this video because it's a huge subject, and there are many, many people trying to work out exactly what consciousness is. Some people think that it's inside the brain, some people think that it's outside the brain and separate to matter or the body. So, for the purposes of this discussion, I want to talk about the fact that brain is matter or material that is run by consciousness. I personally believe that the mind or consciousness is separate to the body. I also believe it operates the body and stimulates the brain in different ways. So let's talk about the mind to be consciousness, and the brain to be electrical activity that occurs inside the brain. Now, obviously, they are interlinked. Obviously, it is impossible to fully separate mind and the brain because they work with one another. My thinking comes from years of reading things. One of the things that's most interesting for me is a chap called Wider Penfield, who is a brain surgeon, and he ran a lot of different experiments placing electrodes on different parts of the brain to find out what could actually be achieved involuntarily with electrical stimulation. So, for example, what he did is he placed electrodes on certain parts of the brain, and he could cause the body to move. He could cause the arm to lift or the leg to move. He could even create movement in the vocal cords. However, the really profound observation that he made for me was the fact that there is no place in the cerebral cortex where any kind of electrical stimulation or electrical current can cause a patient to decide, so can actually create what you might term as will. So this for me is really interesting, and this leads me to believe that consciousness is something different to brainwave activity, i.e., in my mind, the body material is emergent from consciousness, i.e. created from consciousness, and integrally linked in the sense that consciousness is constantly impacting matter. So consciously, or consciousness is driving a lot of brainwave activity. And brainwave activity is really where I'm going here when I'm thinking about how we use the term conscious mind, subconscious mind, unconscious mind, especially within NLP. So for me, I'm wondering, what is it that causes us to use those generic terms when actually we could talk about frequency or hertz? So let's talk about it in terms of brainwave activity and what's going on. And just to be clear, hertz is a word that we now use for cycles per second. And you'll see from this diagram on the left, it's basically the number of times that the wave goes up and down. And this is representing electrical activity in the brain for the purposes of this discussion. And I like to think of hertz as, I don't know if you've ever cycled up a hill. Effectively, you have to almost stand up on the pedals in order to, well, I do. I'm sure there are other people who are much stronger than I am who can cycle with ease. However, when I'm going up a steep gradient, I have to stand on my pedals in order to move my bicycle up the gradient. And this for me represents hertz. It represents the number of oscillation cycles, the number of times that the wave goes up and down per second. Then when we talk about electrical activity in the brain, we've also got amplitude. And amplitude represents the maximum extent of a vibrational oscillation and effectively the electrical potential. So, as we know, amplifiers increase the volume of sound waves. So the amplitude is shown measured on this diagram. You can see basically it's how high from the middle or the equilibrium that the wave moves. So if we start to think about brain waves in terms of amplitude and hertz or cycles per second, then we can start to look at the 5 major brain waves and the impact on our behavior, which is really what we're talking about here. So we've got beta brain waves that operate between 12 and 30 hertz, and this is our normal waking state, our normal waking consciousness. And when we are stressed, beta is heightened and becomes more frequent. So this is our normal waking state, our beta brainwave. Then when we start to go into deep relaxation, we access the alpha brainwaves. And by the way, the next slide coming is actually going to show you images of this, which might be more helpful. It's always more helpful for me to see images. So the alpha brainwaves operate between 7.5 and 14 hertz, and we experience these brainwaves when we're in deep relaxation. Theta is the brainwave pattern that we experience in meditation and in light sleep, and it's operating between 4 and 7.5 hertz. Delta brainwave is that very deep, dreamless sleep and transcendental meditation experience. It's where we lose all concept of time, and effectively our body is very still, and guess what? This is where our unconscious mind is deeply, deeply active. So even when we're operating in our unconscious, we're very, very active. So this is the reason that I'm starting to say, okay, so our conscious mind, as we might call it today, is probably most present in our beta brainwave pattern. And actually when we're overthinking, when we're overconscious, that's when we're operating in stress. So that beta brainwave pattern is very much correlated with what we're currently calling the conscious mind. And a more recently discovered brainwave is actually what you might call sort of heightened awareness, and it's called gamma, and it operates above 40 hertz, and it's associated with sudden insight. For me, I wonder, honestly, if this is a combination between alpha and beta, and maybe when the two waves interact, they actually create gamma. However, you know what? I'm not a scientist studying human brainwaves, so I don't know if that's correct or not. That for me is just thinking about how waves interact and maybe how suddenly a heightened awareness can be created. So let's have a look at this image, and thank you very much to choosemuse.com for this image. I rather liked it. And you can see that gamma, which is operating at high frequency, is at the top here, and our normal waking state, beta, is in green in the second row. What's interesting for me as I look at these patterns is the change in the amplitude. So for example, if you look at theta and if you look at delta, the amplitude of the wave seems actually much greater than in beta or gamma. And that for me is really interesting. Even though the frequency is much lower, the amplitude in part seems to be really quite high. So what I'm proposing is that rather than talking about conscious and unconscious mind, especially when we're looking at concepts like hypnosis, which we use a lot of in NLP, especially when we're looking at conscious mind and stress-related anxiety or worry or fear, where we tend to be operating in a more beta brainwave pattern, then maybe we should or could be talking about frequency instead. Perhaps we could refer to high frequency brainwave patterns when we're talking about conscious mind concepts, and perhaps we could talk about less frequent or low frequent brainwave patterns when we're talking about the unconscious mind. And in addition to this, I think what could be really interesting is the idea that actually consciousness encompasses or creates all of these brainwave patterns. So when we talk about consciousness perhaps in hypnosis or consciousness perhaps in meditation, maybe we can look at this differently, because actually in meditation we're looking to access alpha and theta and sometimes delta brainwave patterns, which are the lower frequency brainwave patterns that tend to have a higher amplitude. So rather than thinking about being conscious as in very alert and very awake, perhaps we can think about how our consciousness is operating whatever our brainwave pattern, and perhaps our brainwave patterns just allow us to access different levels of consciousness. So really what I'm suggesting is that consciousness can be accessed from any brainwave patterns. So even when we're dreaming, or even when we are in our deep dreamless sleep state, or in transcendental meditation, in delta brainwave pattern, we are still accessing consciousness. We're still adding to our awareness, and it may not be the kind of awareness that we have in beta brainwave pattern, and yet it is building in our deep unconscious, and we have awareness and we have connection to consciousness. So this is what I've been thinking about. I hope it gives you food for thought. You may agree, you may disagree, and if you have any comments, please drop them in the comment box and I will come back to you. Speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.